Chapter 6: Totalitarian and its Dictatorship. There actually exists such a thing as a technique of mass brainwashing. This technique can take root in a country if an inquisitor is strong and shrewd enough. He can make most of us his victim, albeit temporarily. What in the structure of society has made man so vulnerable to this mass manipulation of the mind? This is a problem with tremendous implication, just as brainwashing is. In recent years, we have grown more and more aware of the human interdependency with all its difficulties and complications. I'm aware of the fact that investigation of the subject of mental coercion and thought control becomes less present as time goes on. This is so because it may become more of a threat to us here and now, and our concern for China and Korea must yield to the more immediate needs at our own door. Can totalitarian tendency take over here, and what social symptoms may lead such phenomena? Stern reality confronts us with the universal mental battle between thought control and its corollaries, and our standards of decency, personal strength, personal ideas, and a personal conscience with autonomy and dignity. Future social scientists will be better able to describe the cause of advert of totalitarian thinking and acting in man. We know that after wars and evolution, this mental deterioration more easily finds the opportunity to develop, helped by special psychopathic personalities who only flourish on man's misery and confusion. It is also true that the next generation spontaneously begins to correct the misdeeds of the previous one because of the ruthless system has become too threatening to them. My task, however, is to describe some symptoms of the totalitarian process, which implies deterioration of the thinking and acting, as I have observed them in our own epoch, keeping in mind that the system is one of the most violent and disastrous of man's consistent mental growth. No brainwashing is possible without totalitarian thinking. The tragic facts of political experience in our age make it all too clear that applied psychological technique can brainwash entire nations and reduce their citizens to a kind of mindless robotism which become for them a normal way of living. Perhaps we can best understand how this frightening thing comes about by examining a mythical country, which for the sake of convenience we shall call it totalitarian. The robotization of man. First, let me utter a word of caution. We must not make the mistake of thinking that there is any one particular nation that can be completely identified with this hypothetical land. The characteristics to be discussed can come into existence here. Some of totalitarian characteristics were, of course, present in the Nazi Germany, and they can today be found behind the Iron Curtain, but they exist to some extent in other parts of the world as well. Totalitarian is any country in which political ideas degenerate into senseless formulation made only for propaganda purposes. It is any country in which a single group, left or right, acquires absolute power and becomes omniscient and omnipotent. Any country in which disagreement and differences of opinion are crimes, in which utter conformity is the price of life. Totalitarian, the Ruthenian state, is home of the political system we call euphemistically totalitarianism, in which systemized tyranny is a part. This system does not derive from any honest political philosophy, either socialist or capitalist. Totalitarian leaders may mouth ideologies, but these are in fact mainly casual used to justify the regime. If necessary, totalitarianism can change its slogan and its behavior overnight. For totalitarianism embodies to me the quest of total power, the quest of a dictator to rule the world. The words and the concept of socialism and communism may serve, like democracy, as a disguise for the megalomaniac intention of the tyrant. Since totalitarianism is essentially the social manifestation of the psychological phenomena belonging to every personality, it can best be understood in terms of human forces that create, foster, and perpetuate it. Man has two faces. He wants to grow toward maturity and freedom, and yet the primitive child in his unconscious yearns for complete protection and irresponsibility. His mature self learns how to cope with the restriction and frustration of daily life, but at the same time, the child in him longs to hit out against them, to beat them down, to destroy them, whether they be objects or people. Totalitarianism appeals to this confused infant in all of us. It seems to offer a solution to the problems man's double yearning creates. Our mythical totalitarian is a monolithic and absolute state in which doubt, confusion, and conflict are not permitted to be shown, for the dictator purposes to solve all his subjects' problems for them. In addition, totalitarian can provide official sanction for the expression of man's most antisocial impulse. The uncivilized child hidden in us may welcome this liberation from ethical frustrations. On the other hand, our free, mature social selves cannot be happy in the totalitarian. They revolt against the restriction of individual impulses. The psychological roots of totalitarianism are usually irrational, destructive, and primitive, though disguised behind some ideology, and for this reason, there is something fantastic, unbelievable, and even nightmarish about the system itself. There is, of course, a difference in the psychic experience of the elite, who can live out their needs for power, and the masses, who have to submit, yet the two groups influence each other. When a dictator deep neurotic needs for power also satisfies some profound emotional need in the population of his country, especially in times of misery or after a revolution, he is more easily able to assume the power for which he longs. If a nation has suffered defeat in war, for example, its citizens feel shame and resentment. Loss of faith is not simply a political abstraction. It is a very real and personal thing to be a conquered people. Every man, consciously or unconsciously, identifies with this native land. If a country suffers from prolonged famine or severe depression, its citizens become bitter, depressed, and resentful, and will more willingly accept the vision and the promises of the aspiring dictator. If the complexity of a country's political and economical apparatus makes the individual citizen feel powerless, confused, and useless, if he has no sense of anticipation in the forces that govern his daily life, or if he feels these forces to be so vast and confusing that he can no longer understand them, he will grasp at the totalitarian opportunity for belonging, for participation, for a simple formula that explains and rationalizes what is beyond his comprehension. And then, the dictator has taken over finally. He transfers his own abnormal fantasies, his rage and anger, easily to his subject. Their resentment feeds his pseudo-strength encourages them. A mutual fortification of illusion takes place. Totalitarianism as a social manifestation is a disease of interhuman relationship, and like any other disease, man can best resist its corroding effects if, through knowledge and training, he is well immunized against it. If, however, he is unfortunate enough to catch the totalitarian bug, he has to master all the positive forces in his mind to defeat it. The raging internal struggle between the irresponsible child and the mature adult in him continues until one or the other is finally destroyed completely. As long as a single spark of either remains, the battle goes on, and for as long as a man is alive, the quest for maturity keeps on. Cultural predilection for totalitarianism. In the battle against this dread disease, social factors as well as personal ones play an important role. We can see this role clearly if we analyze the ways in which the ideals of culture as a whole affects its citizens' vulnerability to totalitarianism. The ethics of our own Western civilization are our own strongest defenses against the disease. For the ideal of those ethics is to produce a breed of men and women who are strongly individualistic and who evaluate the situation primarily in terms of their own concerns. We aim to develop in our own citizens a sense of self-responsibility, a willingness to confront the world as it is, and an ability to distinguish between right and wrong through their own feelings and thoughts. Such men and women are impelled to action by their personal moral standard rather than by what some outside group set up as correct. They are unwilling to accept group evaluation immediately unless these coincide with their own personal conviction or unless they have been able to discuss them in the democratic way. People like this are responsible to their communities because they are first responsible to themselves. If they disagree, they will form a royal minority, using their rights of convincing other people at appropriate times. There are other cultures which emphasize attitudes and values that are different from this. The Eastern ideal of man, as we find in China and some other Oriental countries, is in the first place that of the oneness, of being one with the family, one with the fatherland, one with the cosmos, nirvana. The Oriental psyche looks for the direct aesthetic contact with the reality through an impermeable empathy and intuition. Eternal truth is behind reality, behind the veil of Maya. Man is part of the universe. His ideal is passive stability and non-irritability. There are other cultures which emphasize attitudes and values that are different from this. The Eastern ideal of a man, as we find in the China and some other Oriental countries, is in the first place that of the oneness, of being one with the family, one with the fatherland, one with the cosmos, nirvana. The Oriental psyche looks for the direct aesthetic contact with reality through an impermeable empathy and intuition. Eternal truth is behind reality, behind the veil of Maya. Man is part of the universe. His ideal is passive stability and non-irritability. His ideal of peace lies in the rest and relaxation, in meditation, in being without manual and mental travel. The happiness of the Oriental psyche lies in the ecstasy of feeling united with the universal cosmos. As cases, self-redemption and poverty are better realized ideals in the Oriental culture than in our Western society. The classic Oriental culture pattern can best be described as a pattern of participation. In it, the individual is looked upon as an integral part of the group, the family, the caste, the nation. He is not a separate independent entity. In his culture, greater conformity to and acceptance of the corrective rules are the ideals. An Oriental child may be trained from the infancy into a pattern of submission to authority and to the rules of the group. Many primitive cultures also display this pattern. To a person raised in these cultures, the most acceptable standards, the best conceivable thoughts and actions, are those sanctioned by the group. The totalitarian world of mass actions and mass thought is far more comprehensive to the members of the participation pattern and less individual-minded culture that is too Western individualist. What is to us unbearable and regimentation and authoritarianism may be to them comforting order and regularity. An example of intensified pattern of participation and thought control and mutual spying has been given in the apologist E.P. Dozier, The New York Times, December 11, 1955, Science Newsletter, December 3, 1955. The Pueblo Indians of the Rio Grande area believe that wrongdoing or wrong thinking of one man in the tribe affects all members. He may upset the cosmic balance by ill feeling toward any of the fellow of his men. The moral code of the village is group-centered. The individual who transgresses this jeopardizes the well-being of all. Epidemics, crop failures, droughts are interpreted as a result of diversionism of one member of the group. Village members are closely watched and spied on in order to discover the culprit or witch. Gossip and accusation of witchcraft are rampant, and the Pueblo Indian constantly searching in his own concerns for harmful thoughts and attitudes. It is as if we watch the ritual of the purge in the totalitarian state. Such forms of creeping collectivism and participation we may see in every group formation where tolerance for nonconformism ceases to exist. Wherever dogmatic partnership dominates, the mind is coerced. We may even deter such encroaching tendencies in some scientific circles where there exists an overemphasis of group research, teamwork, membership cards, and disdain for individual opinion. The culture into which a man is born and his own psychological constitution interact to produce his personality is much the same way as his body and mind interact to produce his behavior. Our culture of individual freedom may offer us a partial immunity to the disease of totalitarianism, but at the same time, our personal immaturities and repressed savageries can make us vulnerable to it. The participation type of culture may make men more susceptible in general to totalitarianism. although personal striving toward maturity and individuality can offer them, too, some measure of protection against it. Because of the interaction between these social and personal forces, no culture is completely safe from internal attack by totalitarianism and from the mental destruction it may create. As I said before, our totalitarian is a mythical country, but the blunt truth is that any country can be turned into totalitarian. The aims of the rulers of our fictitious country are simply formulated despotism, the total domination of man and mankind, and the unity of the entire world under one dictatorial authority. At first glance, this idea of unity can be most attractive. The idea, oversimplified, of a brotherhood unity of nation and a central powerful agency. When the world is one, it will seem that there will be no more war. The tension that faces us will be eliminated. Earth will become a paradise. But the simplified conception of a universal dictatorship is false and reflects the dangers inherent in the totalitarian goal. All men are different, and it is in the difference between them that creates a greatness, the variety, and the creative inspiration of life, as well as the tension of social intercourse. The totalitarian conception of equalization can be realized only in death, when the chemical and the physical laws that govern all of us take over completely. Death is indeed the great equalizer. In life, all of us are different. Our bodies and minds interact with one another and with the outside world in different ways. Each man's personality is unique. True, all of us share certain basic human qualities with all other members of the human race, but the difference in personality are also so many and so varied that no two men anywhere in the world or even in all human history can be said to be exactly alike. This uniqueness is true of the citizen of totalitarian as anyone else. As a human being, he is not only different from us, he is different from his compatriots. However, to create man in the totalitarian image through reveling and equalization means to suppress what is essentially personal and human in him. The uniqueness and the variety to create society of robots, not men. The noted social scientist J.S. Brunner, in his introduction to the Banner Book of the Soviet Psychology, has expressed this thought in a different way. Man's image for the nature of man is not only a matter of objective inquiry, it is and has always been prime instrument of social and political control. He who molds the image does so with enormous consequences for the society in which he lives. In life, all of us are different. Our bodies and minds interact with one another and with the outside world in a different ways. Every man's personality is unique. True, all of us share certain basic human qualities with all the other members of the human race, but the difference in personality are also so many and so varied that no two men anywhere in the world or ever in all human history can be said to be exactly alike. This uniqueness is as true as the citizen of the totalitarian as it is to anyone else. As a human being, he is not only different from us, he is also different from his compatriots. However, to create man in totalitarian image through reveling and equalization means to suppress what is essentially personal and human in him, the uniqueness and the variety, and to create a society of robots, not men. The noted social scientist J.S. Brunner, in his introduction of the Banner Book on the Soviet Psychology, has expressed his thought in a different way. Man's image of the nature of man is not only a matter of objective inquiry, it is and has always been a prime instrument of social and political control. He who molds that image does so with enormous consequences for the society in which he lives. Totalitarian fosters the illusion that everyone is part of the government, a voter. No one can be a non-voter or anti-voter. His inner pros and cons and doubts are not private problems of the individual himself anymore. His thoughts belong to the state, the dictator, the ruling circle, the party. His inner thoughts have to be controlled. Only those in power know what exactly lies behind the national policy. The ordinary citizens becomes as dependent and obedient as the child. In exchange for giving up his individuality, he obtained some special gratifications: the feeling of belonging, of being protected, the sense of relief over losing his personal boundaries and responsibilities, the ecstasy of being taken up, absorbed in the world, uncontrolled corrective feelings, the safety of being anonymous, of being merely a cog in the wheel of all other powerful states. The despotism of modern totalitarian is very different from the lush, exotic, personal tyrants of ancient times. It is ecstatic, cold, mechanical force, aiming at what Hanan Alched calls transformation of human nature itself. In our theoretical country, man has no individual ego any longer, no personality, no self. The reveling system is at work, and everything above the common level is trampled on the beaten down. The totalitarian reader. The readers of totalitarian are the strangest men in the state. These men are like other people, unique in their mental structure, and consequently, we cannot make any bracket psychiatric diagnosis of the mental illness in which motivates their behavior. But we can make some generalization which will help us towards some understanding of the totalitarian leader. Obviously, for example, he suffers from the overwhelming need to control other human beings and to exert unlimited power, and this in itself is a psychological aberration, often rooted in deep-seated feelings of anxiety, humiliation, and inferiority. The ideologies such as men profound are only used as tactical and strategical devices through which they hope to reach their final goal of complete domination over other men. This domination may help them compensate for pathological fear and feelings of unworthiness, as we can conclude from the psychological study of some modern dictators. Fortunately, we do not have to rely on the purely hypothetical picture of the psychopathology of the totalitarian dictator. Dr. J.M. Gilbert, who studies some of the readers of the Nazi Germany during the Nuremberg trials, has given us the useful insights into which twisted minds, useful especially because it reveals to us something about the mutual interaction between the totalitarian leader and those who want to be led by him. Hitler's suicide made a critical investigation of his character structure. Impossible, but Dr. Gilbert had many eyewitnesses and reports of Hitler's behavior from his friends and collaborators, and this presents a fantastic picture of the Nazism prime mover. Hitler was known among his intimates as the carpenter because he often threw himself on the floor in a kicking, screaming fit like an epileptic rage. From such reports, Dr. Gilbert was able to deduce something about the roots of the pathological behavior displayed in his morbid genius. Hitler's paranoid hostility against the Jew was partly related to his unresolved parental conflicts. The Jews probably symbolized for him the hated drunken father who mistreated Hitler and his mother when the future for her was still a child. Hitler's obsessive thinking, his furious fanaticism, his insistence of maintaining the purity of the Aryan blood, and his ultimate mania to destroy himself and the world were obviously the results of the sick psyche. As early as 1923, nearly 10 years before they seized power, Hitler was convinced that he would one day rule the world, and he spent time designing monuments for victory and analyzing his glory to be elected all over the European continent when the day of victory arrived. His delusion preoccupation continued until the end of his life. In the midst of the war he created, which led him to defeat the death, Hitler continued revising and improving his architecture plans. Nazi dictator number 2, Hermann Göring, who committed suicide to escape the hangman, had a different psychological structure. His pathologically aggressive drives were encouraged by the Arctic military tradition of the German junker class, to which his family belonged. From early childhood, he had been compulsively and overtly aggressive. He was an autocratic and a corrupt cynic, grasping the Nazi-created opportunity to achieve purely personal gain. His contempt for the commonplace was unabandoned. This was a man who had literally no sense of moral values. Quite different again was Rudolf Hess, the man of passive yet fanatical dog-like devotion, living, as it were, by proxy through the mind of his Führer. His inner mental weakness made it easier for him to live through means of proxy than through his own personality. and drove him to become the shadow of a seemingly strong man, from whom he would borrow strength. The Nazi ideology gave his frustrated boy the illusion of broad identification with the glorious German race. After his wild flight to England, Hess showed obvious psychotic traits. His delusion of persecution, hysterical attacks, and periodic amnesia are among the well-known clinical symptoms of schizophrenia. Still another type was Hans Frank, the devil's advocate, the prototype of an ambitious, latent homosexual, easily seduced into political adventure, even when this was in conflict with the remnants of his conscience. For unlike Göring, Frank was capable of distinguishing between right and wrong. Dr. Gilbert also tells us something about General Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief of staff, who became the submissive automatic mouthpiece of the Führer, mixing military honor and personal ambition in the service of his own unimportance. Of a different quality is the SS Colonel Hosses, the murderer of millions in the concentration camps of the Auschwitz. A pathological character structure is obvious in this case. All his life, Hosses had been a lonely, withdrawn, socialist personality without any conscience, wallowing in his own hostile and destructive fantasies. Alone and bereft of human attachment, he was intuitively sort of Hillman for his most savage of all the Nazis' job. He was a useful instrument for the commission of the most bestial deeds. Unfortunately, we have no clear psychiatric picture yet of the Russian dictator Stalin. There have been several reports that during the last years of his life, he had a tremendous persuasion phobia and lived in a constant terror that he would become a victim of his own purges. Psychological analysis of this man shows clearly that pathological culture, a mad world, can be built up by certain impressive psychoneurotic types. The venal political figures need not even comprehend the social and the political consequences of their behavior. They are compelled not by ideological belief, no matter how much they may rationalize to convince themselves they are, but by the distortions of their own personalities. They are not motivated by the advertised urge to serve their country or mankind, but rather by an overwhelming need and compulsion to satisfy the cravings of their own pathological character structures. The ideologies they spout are not real goals. They are the cynical devices by which these sick men hope to achieve some personal sense of wealth and power. Subtle inner lies seduce them into going from bad to worse. Defensive self-deception, arrested insights, evasion of emotional identification with others, degradation of empathy. The mind has many defense mechanisms with which to blind the conscience. A clear example of this can be seen in the way the Nazi leaders defended themselves through the continuous self-justification and exculpation when they were brought before the bar and the Nuremberg trials. These murderers were aggrieved and hurt by the accusation brought against them. They were the very picture of injured innocence. Any form of leadership, even checked by controls, may gradually turn into dictatorship. Being a leader, carrying great power and responsibility for another people's lives, is a monumental test for human psyche. The weak leader is the man who cannot meet it, who simply abdicates his responsibilities. The dictator is the man who replaces the existing standards of justice and morality by more and more private prestige, by more and more power, and eventually isolates himself more and more from the rest of humanity. His suspicion grows, his isolation grows, and the vicious cycle leading to paranoid attitude begins to develop. The dictator is not only a sick man, he is also a cruel opportunist. He sees no value in any other person and feels no gratitude for any help he may have received. He is suspicious and dishonest and believes that his personal needs justify any means he may use to achieve them. Peculiarly enough, every tyrant still searches for some self-justification. Without such a soothing device for his own conscience, he cannot live. His attitude towards other people is manipulative. To him, they are merely tools for the advancement of his own interest. He rejects the conception of doubt, of internal contradictions, of man's inborn ambivalence. He denies the psychological fact that man grows to maturity through groping, through trial and error, through the interplay of contrasting feelings. Because he will not permit himself to grope, to learn through trial and error, The dictator can never become a mature person, but whether he acknowledges them or not, he has internal conflicts. He suffers somewhere from internal confusion. These inner weaknesses he tries to repress sternly. If they are to come to the surface, they might interfere with the achievement of his goals. Yet in the attacks of range, his weakening strength is evident. It is because the dictator is afraid, albeit unconsciously, of his own internal contradiction, that he is afraid of the same internal contradiction of his fellow men. He puts purge and purge, terrorize and terrorize in order to steal his own raging inner drives. He must kill every doubter, destroy every person who makes a mistake, imprison everyone who cannot be proved to be utterly single-minded. In totalitarian, the latent aggression and savagery in the minds are cultivated by the dictator to such a degree that they can explode into a mass criminal actions. Shown by Hitler's persuasion of minorities, ultimately, the country shows a real pathology, an utter dominance and destructive and self-destructive tendencies. The final surrender of the robot man. What happens to the common man in such a culture? How can we describe the citizen of totalitarian? Perhaps the simplest answer to this question lies in the statement that he is reduced to the mechanical precision of an insect-like state. He cannot develop any warm friendship, loyalties and allegiances because they may be too dangerous for him. Today's friend may be, after all, tomorrow's enemy. Living in an atmosphere of constant suspicion, not only of strangers, but even of his own family, he is afraid to express himself lest concentration camp or prison swallow him up. The citizens of totalitarian do not really converse with one another. When they speak, they whisper, first looking furtively over their shoulders for the inevitable spy. Their inner silence is in the sharp contrast of the official verbal bombardment. The citizen of a totalitarian may make noise and utter polite banalities, or they may repeat slogans for one another, but they say nothing. Existing literature reveals that leading authors, among them H.G. Wells, Huxley, and Orwell, grow more and more concerned about the ghastly future of the robotized man, trained as a machine as a standard of conformity. This translates for us the common fear of a mechanized civilization. In totalitarian, the citizen no longer knows the real core of his mind. He no longer feels himself an I, an ego, a person. He is only an object of official barrage and mental coercion. Having no personality of his own, he has no individual conscience, no personal morality, no capacity to think clearly and honestly. He learns thousands of indoctrinated facts and inhales dogma and slogans with every breath he draws. He becomes an obedient pedant. A pedantry makes people into something resembling pots filled with information instead of individuals with free, growing personalities. Becoming wiser and freer implies selective forgetting and changes of mind. This we accept, this we leave behind. Alert adjustment requires a change of patterns, the capacity to be deconditioned, to undo and unlearn in order to become a ripe of new patterns. The citizen of totalitarian has no chance of such learning through unlearning, for growth through individual experience. Official oversimplification induces the captive audience into acceptance and indoctrination. Mass ecstasy, mass fanaticism are substituted for quiet individual thought and consideration. Hitler taught his people to march and to do battle, and at the end they did not know wherefore they marched and battled. People become herds, indoctrinated and observed herds, intoxicated first with enthusiasm and happy expectation, then with terror and panic. The individual personality cannot grow in totalitarian. The huge mass of citizens is tamed into personal and political somnambulism. It may be scientifically questionable to compare experiences gained from individual pathological states with social phenomena and analyze the partial collapse of the ego under the totalitarianism by analogy with the actual case of madness. But there is in fact much that is comparable between strange reaction of the citizen of totalitarian and their culture as a whole, on the one hand, and the reactions of the introverted. But there is a fact match that is comparable between the strange reaction of citizens of totalitarian and their culture as a whole on the other hand, and reaction of the introverted, sick, schizophrenic on the other. Even though the problem of schizophrenic behavior in individuals and groups is extremely complicated and cannot be fully handled within the scope of this book, the comparison can be helpful in our search for the understanding of the nature and the effects of totalitarianism, the common retreat from reality. This excursion into the world of pathology is not a description of the mere coincidental resemblance between the disease and the political scheme. It should serve to point up the fact that totalitarian withdrawal behind official justification and individual fantasy is something that can occur either in social life or inside the individual mind. And many scholars believe in relationship between cultural deterioration and schizophrenic withdrawal. Let us briefly explain the individual schizophrenic reaction of complete inner automation and mental withdrawal as a personal failure to adjust to the world experience as insecure and dangerous. Often rather simple emotional incidences may lead to such schizophrenic retreat. For instance, the intrusion of the schedules and habits forced to the mind during the infancy, or a shy hypersensitive to the overreactive and overdose culture. Often rather simple emotional incidences may lead to such schizophrenic retreat. For instance, the intrusion of the schedules and habits forced of the mind during the infancy, or a shy hypersensitivity to a overreactive and overbose culture. Many a child is forced into schizophrenic withdrawal by their overcompulsive parent. Sometimes a lack of the external contact may drive a man into a state of utter loneliness and isolation, sometimes his own preference for solitude. A certain tendency of the so-called schizophrenic withdrawal has been proved to be inborn, yet it can be provoked in everybody. Whatever the case, the schizophrenic patient becomes a desocialized being, lost in loneliness. Conscious and unconscious fantasies, life begins to become dominant over alert and confrontation of reality. In the end, his weird fantasies become more real for the schizophrenic than the actual world. He hides more and more behind his own iron curtain in the imaginary dreamland and retreat he has built for himself. This is his nirvana, in which all his dreams wishes are fulfilled. Inertia and fascism alternate. The patient regresses to an infertile vegetative form of behavior and rejects everything that society has taught him. In his fantasy, he lives in a world which always obeys his commands. He is omnipotent. The world turns around according to his divine inclinations. Reality, requiring as it does continued and renewed adjustment and verification, becomes a prosecutor attacking his illusion of divine might. Every disturbing intrusion into his delusional world is encountered by the schizophrenic either with tremendous aggression or with the formation of secondary delusion to protect the first delusion, or with a combination of both. The schizophrenic displays tremendous hostility toward the real world and its representative. Reality robs him both of his delusion and omnipotence and his hallucinatory sense of being utterly protected as he was in the womb. Clinical experience has shown that the disease of schizophrenia often begins with negativism, a defense against the influence of others, a continual fight against mental intrusion, against what is felt as a rape of the oversensitive mind. Gradually, his defensive attitude toward the world becomes a hostile attitude towards everything, not only toward influences from the outside, but also towards thoughts and feelings from the inside. Finally, the victim becomes paralyzed by his own hostility and negativism. He behaves literally as though he were dead. He sits unmoving for hours. He may have to be force-fed, force-dressed. The schizophrenic moves like a puppet on a string, only when someone compels him to. Clinically, we call this catatonia, the death attitude, the retreat to automation. Introverted schizophrenic prefer the automatic routine life of aserium to life in the outside world, on the condition that they be allowed to indulge their private fantasies. They surrender utterly to the self-defeatism. They never congregate in groups. They seldom talk with one another. Even when they do, they never have any real mutual contact. Each one lives in their own retreat. In the totalitarian myth, think, for instance, as does Frederick in the psychological folklore of the mythical state, the vague fantasy of the technical perfected womb, the ideal nirvana, plays a tremendous role. In a world full of insecurities, a world requiring continual alert adjustment and readjustment, totalitarian creates the delusion of the omnipotent, miraculous ideal state, a state where, in its final form, every material need will be satisfied. Everything will be regulated just as it was for the fetus in the womb, the land of bliss and equanimity, just as it is for the schizophrenic in the mental hospital. This is no social struggle, no mental struggle. The world moves like a clockwork. There is no real interplay between people, no clash of opinion or beliefs. There is no emotional relationship between these womb fellows. Each exists as a separate number-bearing entity in the same feeling system. In totalitarian, there is no faith in fellow men, no caritas, no love, because a real relationship between men do not exist, just as they do not exist between schizophrenics. There is only faith in and subjection to the feeding system, and there is in every citizen a tremendous fear of being expelled from that system, a fear of being totally lost, comparable with the schizophrenic's feeling of rejection or fear of reality. In the midst of spiritual loneliness and isolation, there is the fear of still greater loneliness, of more painful isolation. Without protective regulations from the outside, internal hell may break rules. Strong mechanical external order must be used to cover the internal chaos of approaching breakdown. We have had experiences in post-war years in several refugees from the totalitarian world who broke down when they had to cope with a world of freedom where personal initiative was required. We have had experiences in post-war years with several refugees from the totalitarian world who broke down when they had to cope with a world of freedom where personal initiative was required. The fear of freedom brought them to the state of panic. They no longer had strong enough egos to build and maintain their defenses against the competitive demands of the free democratic reality. As in schizophrenia, a maneuverable and individual ego cannot exist in totalitarian. In schizophrenia, the ego shrinks as a result of withdrawal. In totalitarian, as a result of constant merging in mass feelings. If such a shrunken ego should grow up, with its own critical attitude, its need for verification of facts and for understanding, it will be beaten down for being treacherous and non-conforming. Totalitarian requires of its citizen complete subjection to the identification with the leader. It is in this leader dominance that makes people nearly egoless, as they are in schizophrenia. This again may result in loss of control of hostile and destructive drives. Psychologists have seen this time and time again in what we can call the concentration camps thing. When the victim first came to the camp dedicated to their gradual extermination, most of them displayed a complete loss of self, an utter depersonalization, combined with the apathy and loss of awareness. The sense of observation have been made among the prisoners of war in Korea. Some concentration camp victims got better immediately after their return to the normal society. In others, this schizophrenic reaction to lost ego remained and, as mentioned above, sometimes developed into a real psychosis. The womb state. Totalitarianism is a man escaped from the fearful realities of life into the vital womb of the leader. The individual's actions are directed from this womb or from the inner sector. The mystic center is in the control of everything. Man need no longer assume responsibility for his own life. The order and logic of the prenatal world reign. There is peace and silence, the peace of utter submission. The members of the womb state do not really communicate. Between them, there is silence, the silence of possible betrayal, not the mature silence of reticence and revertedness. Totalitarian increases the gap between the things one shows and communicates and the things one secretly dreams and thinks deep within oneself. It develops the artificial spirit-mindedness of political silence. Whatever little remains of the individual feelings and opinion is kept carefree and closed. In the schizophrenic world of totalitarian, there is no free mutual exchange, no conversation, no exclamation, no release from the emotional tension. It is a world of silent conspirators. Indeed, the atmosphere of suspicion is the big attacker of the mental freedom because it makes people cling together, conspiring against the mysterious enemies, first from outside, then among themselves. In totalitarian, each citizen is continually watched. The mythical state molds the individual conscience. He has hardly any of his own. His neighbors watch him, his postman, his children, and they all represent the pushing state, just as he himself must represent the state and watch others. Not betraying them is a crime. The need to find conspiracies, to discover persecutors and criminals is another schizophrenic manifestation. It is psychologically related to an infertile need for the feeling of omnipotence. Megalomaniac feelings grow better in an atmosphere of mysterious secrecy. Secrecy and conspiracy increases the delusions of power. That is why so many people like to pry into another people's lives and to play the spy. This feeling of conspiracy also lies behind the pathological struggle with the imaginary persecutors, a struggle to find both in mentally ill individuals and in our mythical totalitarian. It is there. It is changing us. All the inner fears of losing the Navia Cum illusion become rampant. Mysterious ghosts and vultures chase people out of the nirvana and paradise. In these fantasies, the patriarch, the dictator, the idol becomes both the universal danger and the omnipotent savior at the same time. Not even the citizen of totalitarian really love this cruel giant. Suspicion against the breast that feeds and the hand that guides the forbids is often found in the fantasies of the schizophrenic children who experience the nourisher as the enemy, the dominating ogre, bribing the growing mind into submission. The deep hate and the sick individual feels towards the parental figure cannot be expressed directly, and so it is displaced into the self or onto scapegoats. Scapegoatism is also part of the totalitarian strategy. As we pointed out before, the scapegoat temporarily absorbs all the individual's inner fury and rage. Karaks, Negroes, Jews, communists, capitalists, profiteers, warmongers, any of all of them can play that role. Perhaps the greatest danger to the totalitarian mind is the use of the intellect and the awareness of the egghead's demand for free, verifying thinking. Aberration and perversion are also chosen by the citizens of totalitarian as they are by the inhabitants of the madhouse, overtiring intellectual control. In the center of the totalitarian fears the fantasy stands the man-eating god and idol. He is unequivocal. He uses man's great gift of adjustment to bring him to slavery. Every man's inner core of feeling and thoughts has to belong to the leader. Is the citizen of totalitarian consciously aware of this? Probably not. Modern psychology has taught us how strongly the mental mechanism of denial of reality works. The eye bypasses external occurrences when the mind does not want them to happen. Secondary justification and fantasies are formed to support and explain these denials. In totalitarian, we find the same despising of reality facts as we do in schizophrenia. How else are we to explain the fact that Hitler was still moving his armies on paper after they were already defeated? Totalitarian strategy covers inner chaos and conflict by the strict order of the police state. So does the compulsive schizophrenic patient by his inner routine and schedules. These routines and schedules are defenses against painful occurrences in external reality. This internal robotization may lead to denial of the internal realities and internal needs as well. The citizen of totalitarian, repressing and rejecting his inner need for freedom, may even experience a slavery as liberation. He may go even one step further, yearn for the escape from life itself, a delusion that he would become omnipotent through utter destruction. The SS soldiers call this the magic option of Brookid, the tie of bloody crime, binding them together and preparing them for Valhalla. With this magic unification, they could die with courage and equanimity. Anarchic despair and need for greatness altered in them as they do in the psychotic patient. In the same way, the citizen of totalitarian search for the heroic praise in history, even though the price be doom and annihilation. Many soldiers, tired by the rigidness of the normal life, look back at violent moments of their war experiences, despite the hunger and terror, as the monumental culminating experiences of their lives. There, as the brander band of the fighters. They felt happy for the first and only times in their lives. This all sounds like the bitter comedy, but the fantasies of schizophrenic has taught us how the mind can retreat in delusion when there is fear of daily existence. Under these circumstances, fantasies begin to prevail over reality and soon assume validity with which reality never had. The totalitarian mind is like the schizophrenic mind. It has a contempt for reality. Think for a moment of the Risco theory and its denial for the influence of heredity. The totalitarian mind does not observe and verify its impression of reality. It dictates to reality how it shall behave. It compels a reality to conform to its fantasies. The comparison between totalitarianism and psychosis is not incidental. Delusional thinking inevitably creeps into every form of tyranny and despotism. Unconscious backward forces come into action. Evil powers from the archaic past return. An automatic compulsion to go on for self-destruction develops to justify one's mistake into a new one. To enlarge and expand the vicious pathological cycle becomes the dominating end of life. The frightened man, bounded by the culture he does not understand, retreats into the brute fantasies of the limitless power in order to cover up the vacuum inside him. The comparison between totalitarianism and psychosis is not incidental. Delusional thinking inevitably clips into every form of tyranny and despotism. Unconscious backward forces come into action. Evil powers from the archaic past return. An automatic compulsion to go on self-destruction develops to justify one mistake with a new one. To enlarge and expand the vicious pathological circle becomes the dominating end of life. The frightened man, burdened by a culture he does not understand, retreats into a brutal fantasies of the limitless power in order to cover up the vacuum inside himself. This fantasy starts with the leaders and later taken over by the masses they oppress. What else can man do when he is caught up in the tremendous machine called totalitarian? Thinking and brain itself has become superfluous, that is, only reserved for the elite. Man has to renounce his uniqueness, his individual personality, and must surrender to the equalizing and the homogenizing patterns of the so-called interrogation and standardization. This arouses in him the great inner emptiness of the savage child, the emptiness of the robot that ultimately yearns for the great destruction.